Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg dive into the minds and experiences of daily life in the 18th century. In celebration of Black History Month, this February, all of our Exploring Our World videos will be focused on the Black residents of Williamsburg, enslaved and free. I'm Davia Brown, and I'm joined today by Jack Gary, Director of Colonial Williamsburg's Department of Archaeology, and Meredith Poole, Senior Archaeologist. Thank you both for having us here today in the Archaeology Labs to talk about your discoveries and what they tell us about the Black community in Williamsburg. Would you tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Sure, absolutely. And it's great to be here. Glad to have you all here in the lab with us today. I'm the Director of Archaeology. I've been here for about 2 years now with Colonial Williamsburg. Prior to that, I was working for a place called Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest in the western part of Virginia, where I directed the archaeological research there for about 12 years before coming here. I'm honored to be here, and my role is to work with fantastic people like Meredith and our other archaeologists on staff to try and understand everything we can about all the different people, the hidden lives, the hidden landscapes of a place like Colonial Williamsburg.
And I'm Meredith Poole. I have been here for 35 years, so I am the counter to Jack's 2 years. I have excavated at this point on dozens of sites in the historic area, and each of them has been exciting in its own way. But what's fabulous about having that kind of longevity is the opportunity to start to see Williamsburg as a bit of a community and to start to see the patterns in things that make discussions like the one we're going to have today a little bit easier to engage.
We definitely want to engage with you all by having you send in your questions. Just post them in the comments, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can during this live stream. But to get the conversation started, would you all tell us about the role of archaeology here at Colonial Williamsburg as well as its history?
Yeah, sure. I'll get it started, and then I'll kick it over to Meredith to flesh some things out. We've been doing archaeology at Colonial Williamsburg for almost 100 years now. And that has resulted in over 60 million artifacts that have been excavated from all those different sites that we worked on. And so today we're going to take you through every single one of them, right? Number one. No, I'm just kidding. It never gets old. But the role of archaeology here, and it's evolved over the years, but what archaeology is really good at doing is helping to correct and fill in the documentary record. So what we're finding, the artifacts, the things that we find in the ground are, well, they're trash. And this is the stuff that got thrown away. And we've gotten really good at being able to wring as much information out of this trash as we possibly can. And that trash, it's almost equitable in a way. It tells us about the daily lives of people and about communities. Now, that isn't without its challenges, though, particularly when it comes to trying to understand the African American community. So, yes, we can get a lot of information about it, but again, not without certain challenges.
Sure, and a couple of those challenges that always rise to the surface for us are the fact that enslaved people in the 18th century do not have a lot of buying power. They are not making tremendous amounts of money. And the same things that make the 18th century so exciting in sort of overall looking at the consumer revolution often passed by people who were enslaved. And so we don't see them represented in the archaeological record quite as robustly as we see other people represented. Another challenge that is perhaps unique to urban settings like Williamsburg is unlike plantation settings where quarters for enslaved people are physically separate and discrete places. In Williamsburg, we are talking about a situation where there are serious constraints on space, a half acre for every lot. People are living on top of one another, and perhaps more importantly, everybody's trash is going into communal trash pits. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about trying to explore the material lives of enslaved people, one of the challenges we have is separating the materials that were tossed into those trash pits by enslaved people from those who own them on the same lots.
And we have a site that we're working on right now is giving us the opportunity, kind of the rare opportunity, to focus on a site where the African American community came together, and that's the site of the First Baptist Church here in Williamsburg. And so there's an opportunity to investigate the remains of a community, but it's still difficult to get at individuals. So a lot of people are coming together. And as you point out, we have to have, when we can have individual residences that we can tie to people, then we can start to get at individuals. And that it's really challenging for us. But it, again, doesn't mean that we can't get at a lot of questions about this community.
Well, looking back historically at the archaeology program here, particularly in the 1980s, as we were just starting to try to determine how we could fill in details about the lives of the half of Williamsburg's population, more than half of Williamsburg's population that's enslaved, we began by looking at the artifacts that seem to speak most specifically to that group of people. There are certain artifacts that seem unique and are found almost exclusively on sites that we know there is a strong enslaved African presence. And you were going to speak to some of those today, particularly with regard to the ceramics.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you want us to go ahead and launch into it, Davina?
That is actually a perfect thing to do, because one of our first audience questions is about what we found. What are some of the most exciting things that we found here at Colonial Williamsburg?
Yeah, let's do it.
Start it.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as Meredith points out, there are a couple of artifacts and artifact types that we can, with a fairly high degree of certainty, attribute to African Americans. And one of those is a type of low-fired earthenware that I've got some examples of right here. We refer to it as colonoware. Archaeologists call it colonoware. And you can tell, okay, so we've got one here. Yeah, if we show that one too, Meredith. What we're seeing are it's African American and probably also Native American potters are creating this low-fired earthenware, and they're creating it in the forms of European vessels. So we see an example of a stoneware vessel there made in Germany, and here we have a locally made version of that vessel, which is a chamber pot. And what we're seeing are African Americans making this type of ceramic. They're most likely making it on outlying plantations. And we're starting to discover that there's a couple of different types of it. It's not just one type. There are different potters that are involved. We can start to see the marks of these potters. And we can start to see the craftsmen of these individuals. I always like pointing out this little piece on this chamber pot. We'll see if we can get it on the camera there. There's a little tiny kind of flourish here at the bottom of this handle. It has no functional purpose, but it's a mark of craftsmanship. It's an individual taking pride in, and we see it over in this one as well. So we see an individual taking pride in their work. These are burnished, and so going back to this idea that we see a variety of these. So there are different people making these. But what's interesting is it's being used all over town. Everybody is using this stuff. White, black, everybody's using this type of ceramic. And we see the different varieties all over town. We see it from the governor's palace to taverns to small households. And so the indication here to us is that the African Americans who are making this, most likely enslaved people, they have access to the market, probably the actual physical market, probably coming into town to sell wares. And so that starts to change, I think, the narrative for us a little bit, that these people had no agency, that no ability to make money, no entrepreneurial spirit, but we see it right here, and we see it spread all over town, and everyone's buying the stuff and using it. So I like to point that out, because I think we can start to see that. Again, we're not necessarily seeing individuals, but we're seeing a community, and through the way this stuff is distributed around town.
So another artifact that I wanted to bring in along the same lines, and you were talking about money and earning money. I think we have a couple of slides of some coins that were found. Everybody always asks archaeologists whether they find money in the ground, and occasionally we do. But coins like the one you see on your screen right now are particularly exciting to me. This is a Spanish real. It's minted in Mexico, and that one in particular has a date 1809 on it. What you'll notice is that it's got a hole drilled through it on the top, and it's actually not drilled, it's punched through it so that it didn't lose any silver. So this was found on a site where we know there were enslaved and soon to be freed African Americans on that site, and we think it's being used as jewelry. That's typically why coins are being punched through like that. It's interpretations like that require a little bit of ethnographic research, and that particular ethnographic research came from some WPA interviews in the 1930s with people who were formerly enslaved, and they talked about pierced coins as a remedy for everything from rheumatism, it's how you ward off arthritis, to sort of warding off conjurers and evil spirits. The idea that those are sometimes used as birth coins. They're given in the year of a child's birth as good luck. I think we have a second image that's coming up of a similar coin, although it doesn't look it. This too is silver. It didn't show up very well in the image, and this one's a little bit earlier, and it looks incredibly lumpy and bumpy. This one seems to have filled the role that we also hear in those ethnographic interviews, where coins like this are drilled through and then used for teething for children. It's a very practical thing. It helps a tooth to break through, and the fact that it's silver means that it's antimicrobial to a degree, so it's got that effect. But there was apparently recognition of the fact that the ages between 1 and 3 were particularly dangerous for children, and those corresponded with the ages of for teething. And the interpretation that we're using for this, based on other narratives, is that this helped sort of steward a child through, safeguard a child through that dangerous time of teething.
Yeah, and when we think about an object like that, and you started out, you said to retain the silver, right? I mean, it has monetary value.
It does have monetary value.
And so when we think about it as being used as a charm around a child's neck, we're talking about individuals, enslaved individuals usually.
Foregoing its monetary value.
Exactly. So we get to see what is important to this community, and it's the same thing that we all think is important: the health of our children. So it's objects like that start to get us closer to understanding. Again, maybe not a named individual, but certainly what's important to people in the past.
And those are some pretty unique artifacts that we picked out. But really, that's a very limiting way to see how artifacts tell us about enslavement and enslaved people in 18th century America. I think what we're realizing more and more is that every artifact that we encounter has had a more vibrant and robust life in the hands of enslaved people than it did in the hands of the people who purchased it. So, glasses like these were filled by enslaved people, and chamber pots were dumped by, and, objects are washed by and stored by, and when they're broken, they're probably swept up by African Americans.
Yeah, so sometimes it takes us just asking a different question. When a wine glass like this comes out of the ground, the first reaction can be, look at how beautiful this is, how expensive this would have been. Think of the person drinking the wine out of it. But wait a minute, the person drinking the wine out of it probably didn't touch it or have interaction with it nearly as much as the enslaved person that was washing it. Yeah, as you just said, washing it, serving it. So yeah, to see these things, sometimes we have to rethink the questions that we're asking. What are the important questions that we need to be asking?
I think it's really important that even just in these first few items that you've shown us, that these are people who are creative, who are ingenious, who have knowledge and use it to, live their lives within the confines of a slave society. So something that we are trying to make sure we do now in our interpretation and narrative of the enslaved and the free black population here is talk about those aspects that these are people. It doesn't matter what the law says. And that's really important. Yeah. We actually have a lot of great questions coming in from our audience so far, and please continue to send them in. Kelly says that she became an archaeologist because of a trip that she made to Colonial Williamsburg with her grandparents in 1987. She wants to know, how is being an archaeologist at Colonial Williamsburg different from similar work at other sites?
Ooh. Now, see, I would answer that by saying that it is incredibly unique to be able to excavate a town rather than a site, and to understand that what you find on one lot is affected by what's happening on the lot next to it. And so you do start to see these interactions. And so that would be my primary answer to that question.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Having come from working at a plantation, which we can get deep into one community there. Here we have so many different connections. We have multiple sites, and then it's finding all the threads that connect them together. I think that's the really unique opportunity we have for the work that we do here at Colonial Williamsburg.
That's interesting because I don't remember coming here as a child, but my parents said they brought my brothers and I studied anthropology in college, and everyone thought I'd go into archaeology. So,
Our loss.
You know,
It's never too late. It's never too late to be it.
maybe
That's
this is the sign.
Yeah, never too late.
That's right.
Bernie wants to know: have you found things that specifically relate to enslaved African Americans, such as chains and other things that maybe, in a similar vein, had to do with punishment or control?
Yeah, I don't know that we have anything in the collection.
No, I have not found anything, along those lines. But we do. So we have a wonderful story that we've been wrestling with recently, and it relates to the Thecustis Site, where there is a runaway ad for a man by the name of Peter, who has run away in chains, which means that he is a repeat offender along these lines, and he actually has run away in trousers that have been altered to fit his chains. So that's how long he has experienced that type of punishment, and yet he still runs away, and he continues to, and perhaps successfully this final time. I'm not sure we see evidence of Peter being brought back. But I have not found evidence of chains in 35 years.
Yeah, I've not seen any in the collection. No. But it's those stories of resilience. Peter's is a great story. That we see that story over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. It's just striving, constantly striving, consequences aside. Mm-hmm.
Now, Sean asks, are there areas that you are aware of in Colonial Williamsburg that you would like to excavate, but there's an existing structure over the site, so that prevents you from doing so?
So, I guess when I think about that question, over the last 100 years, there has been a lot of moving out of structures. The more modern structures that would impede something like that typically have been moved out already, and we've had that opportunity. If I were to pinpoint something that might answer that question, it's more that our focus is on this narrow period of time in the 18th century, and there are some stories that relate to enslaved people who then are manumitted, where it's actually the early 19th century that's exciting, and maybe not necessarily appropriate for our reconstruction, but a really interesting story. So that's where I would put my answer to that.
Yeah, and I think I'd follow that up with that there are buildings that have been removed.
That's true.
Have been removed
That's
in
true.
order for us to get back to the 18th century that I would kind of like to go back and take a look at. The one that I'm thinking of is the James City County, the training school.
The training school.
Which was a school for African Americans. And that was in the early 20th century.
That's
and
right.
yeah, that's not our usual area of focus here with archaeological research, but it doesn't diminish the importance of a site like that. So there are lots of sites that are now gone that I'd like to go back to.
Yeah, I think that it's worth looking at too, because all these time periods are connected, and the fact that they're part of human history.
That's right.
Could tell us actually a lot more if we can look further past Colonial Williamsburg's era. Going off of something you had said about the Thecustis Site, I know that is one of the sites you're currently working on. Could you tell us about the other one?
Sure. Do you want to talk a little more about the Thecustis Site and the garden that we're working on?
Yeah, we can talk. Yeah, we'll talk real quickly about Thecustis, and we've got a slide that's going to come up here. I want to illustrate, kind of going back to this idea of sometimes we need to frame our questions in a different way. So the Custis Square site it's the home of John Custis IV, who was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia in the early 18th century, and he had on this 4-acre lot one of the most ornate gardens in the country, created by enslaved people, designed by him presumably, but created by enslaved people. And on the site today, if you go there, and what we can see in the picture here, we're excavating along a slope. And it's not very steep, but it is a slope, and it's not natural. This is man-made, and what we've done is our excavations have shown how this slope was carved out in order to create a portion of the garden. And what we were able to do is by, again, asking a different question. We asked, okay, well, how much dirt was moved? And let's put that in human scale. Let's quantify how much dirt was moved. And then let's take it a step further. Okay, well, so many cubic feet of dirt, what does that equate to in terms of a wheelbarrow from the 18th century? How many wheelbarrow loads of an enslaved person's effort and time went into shaping this landscape? And so that's one of the things that we're doing at Custis Square. And there's an artifact that also illustrates that from Custis Square, which is, let's see if we can, yeah, there we go. I think we'll be able to get a shot of that. This is a garden spade that was recovered from Custis Square. This is the tool that would have carved out that landscape. This is the tool that would have created those garden beds for John Custis and maintained them. And while okay, we know what it is, we know what it did, and it doesn't necessarily change too much of our understanding of the individuals, it is now a touch point for us to recognize those individuals. It's another object that allows us to see them. Folks that, so we started out, the documentary record often passes these folks by. All right, well, here is the documentary record for these individuals.
So you were asking about the other property that we are working on, and it's right across the street from Custis Square, and we have been excavating the site of the First Baptist Church, which is one of the earliest all-black congregations in the nation. And we have, since last fall, been exploring the property and trying to identify the footprint of the earliest structure on that lot. So we know that there is an 1856 church that was built by the time the congregation was a little more robust and established, but that congregation got its start in 1776. And before 1818 was on the lot across the street from Custis Square. And what's been really exciting about that project is that the congregation for the First Baptist Church is still a vibrant congregation, and we are doing this project in partnership with them. We are trying to not only identify the building, but help to understand how that property served as a focus for that congregation. It's really early in the process for us. We are just getting down to some of the parts that are of greatest interest to us. So far, we've identified the outline of the earliest church, and we have determined that there are burials at the back of the lot. So over the next 18 months, we will be working more to understand a congregation that this property saw this congregation straight through from enslavement all the way through emancipation to the present day. So we have a tremendous length there of longevity.
Yeah, and the presence of burials there, we're talking about the community. Well, here's the chance to physically see the community. I'm not saying we're going to do that immediately, but only through the partnership with the church would we investigate these burials. But I think there will be the desire to do that in order to do exactly what we've been talking about, what we try to do with artifacts is make the connections with those people. In this case, we have the physical remains of this community, but to be able to do it in partnership with the existing community it's been, well, rewarding and very powerful.
It's just exciting overall because you can see it happening in real time when you follow on our blog post and actually come to Colonial Williamsburg and see what's happening. Going back to artifacts, Doug wants to know, have you been able to analyze the clay on some of those Colonial ceramic artifacts to better understand where in Virginia they might have come from? Or I'll add, if they came from maybe outside of Virginia.
I think Doug is a plant.
Yeah, that's a great,
perfect question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wonder if Doug knows the project that we're working on. Actually, we are working on a project right now to look specifically at colonial ware. And one of the things that we're doing is just, okay, what are the attributes of it? But we're also going to be doing chemical analysis of the clay to see if we can get an idea. I don't want to say we'll be able to source it to its exact spot where it was excavated, but to give us an idea of regionally, are they all coming from the same place? Or do we see different styles that are being perhaps produced in the York River drainage and different styles being produced in the James River drainage? So to answer Doug's question, yes, we're going to be analyzing this clay here coming up actually in the next couple months.
And then Don wants to know, have you found any artifacts that might be considered part of a spiritual cache?
Ooh. That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
And we knew it was coming.
We did know it was coming.
We knew it was coming.
We did know it was coming.
How do we start?
Well, it's hard. So some of the answer to that are artifacts that are quite small, but I'm going to start with this one because it's a little bit larger. So this is an artifact this is an ointment pot, and it is not made locally. This is probably an English variety, and you would have used it to store just any kind of salve. Not this particular one, but we found one of these in a very small hole that was cut through the floor of the Everard kitchen. So we talked earlier about the fact that enslaved people are often living in found spaces. They're living above kitchens, above laundries. They are living in garrets in a house, and so these buildings like kitchens become their sort of second homes. And the fact that this was found in a hole that was really no bigger than the pot itself suggests that it may have had a spiritual component. When archaeologists typically find what we call witch bottles, is how they're often referred to, and they include often they include fingernail clippings or urine or nails, and the whole idea is to draw in evil spirits with the presence of human secretions of some sort, and then the sharp objects in there help trap the evil spirits. And so when we find something like this that we can't explain, we are often drawn to the possibility that it has another function. And you found an interesting one at Custis recently, didn't you?
Yeah. So we found a couple of features at Custis Square that were they're curious, and just like the salve pot, it doesn't make sense to us right away, and so we have to try and put these things in context. One object in a hole could mean anything, but when we start to see patterns, not only within our sites, but with other sites and with ethnographic data, we can start to get a possible spiritual meaning to some of these things. So having said all that, I'm going to talk about some what we found at Custis that we don't know what it is yet. But if we switch over to, I've got a box off to the side here. All right. So what we found was a small hole dug into what may have been a portion of the garden at Custis Square, and inside this hole was this. It was a fully articulated cow foot. This had not been, it does not appear to have been used as food. It appears to have been lopped off and just literally, it looks like it was shoved down into the hole on top of, and I don't have it out here, but on top of a fragment of a cow's skull. That was it. That's the only thing in the hole. Well, you could say, well, that's just a convenient way to get rid of trash. Well, most trash is thrown away into middens away from kitchens. Why put it into its own hole? A couple feet away from this buried cow foot, we also found a fully articulated chicken skeleton in its own hole, head missing. That was it. There was nothing else in it. Why go through the trouble of burying a whole chicken? Well, as we look at other archaeological sites, we've seen that there is evidence for enslaved people burying chickens, burying animals as part of sacrificial rituals or practices that have their origins in West African traditions. And so we have to pull together a lot of data before we can say with any surety that that's what's going on here. So I'm not going to say that's what's going on here yet, but it makes us think, just like we've been talking about. Sometimes you have to ask different questions. All right, well, let's think about this in a different way, and let's see if there are other instances of single chickens buried in certain ways. And once you pull all the data together, then we can perhaps say it was done for this reason, and it's tied to some West African tradition.
Saying that Janice Kennedy always says is they were brought over empty-handed, not empty-headed. So
that's exactly right.
Keep in mind,
that's exactly right.
A lot of these beliefs and practices are preserved by the people. They were taken from where they came from, but they didn't forget who they were, and they passed those down. So who knows what else we'll be finding. As a follow-up, Sean wants to know, how are graves dealt with when discovered? Are they reinterred or given gravestones?
Yeah, okay. Well, you've dealt with some in a variety of ways. I'll give kind of what we're doing with the First Baptist graves right now. We will defer to the congregation, how would you like to treat these? We will not move them, and there's no reason to move them. Matter of fact, commemorating them in place is the most appropriate way to do it. But we do turn to the congregation in this case because these are their people. So we will ask them, how would you best like to commemorate these? That's one way to do it. Other cases, we don't know who some of these people are, and we've had to kind of take other other strategies.
Sure. In places where graves are unmarked and we come across them without recognizing that they are in the way, we move them only, we excavate them and move them only if they are in the middle of a construction zone at the moment. So if they are endangered, that's what we do. Fortunately, graves give you fair warning that they are coming up. You can see the disturbed soil in a distinctive pattern, and so we are able to deal with that before, deal with how we want to handle it before we actually get into the human remains themselves. But unmarked graves are the only ones that we have that experience with, and then it's a long process of getting permitting, going through the state so that we are able to do it all in a way that is above boards and legal.
Yeah. I would say generally when we do find unmarked graves, we will do everything we can to make sure that nothing goes on top of them and that we at least delineate that space. It may be very difficult for us to ever understand who those people are without actually excavating down to them. But if we have the opportunity to just delineate the space as its own space, we will do that.
And it's interesting, one of the things we've been working on recently is just trying to assess everything we know about where people are buried in and around Williamsburg. We keep saying there aren't that many unmarked graves, and we realize we've said that for so long, and it's really not true. But if you put it all on a single map, it is, again, it's about pattern recognition. The more things you put on a map, the more you realize these are sensitive spaces, and we need to be careful as we approach this type of topography, this type of landscape, because it's a type of landscape that's often used for burial.
And particularly as you think about a community that is still here, that these graves are part of this community. It just shows the depth of history of this community, and they're still here.
I think that's an important bottom line too, to think that we don't always know for sure, like history and archaeology and everything, you're always discovering more. So that leads to the question from Ken: was there ever anything found that changed the historical narrative of modern thinking? Something that fundamentally changed the traditional telling of our story?
Wow.
It's a big question.
That is a big question.
That is a deep question.
Wow. Wow.
Something that's fundamentally changed our modern thinking.
Boy.
Well, I'm just.
Ken's going to keep me up late tonight.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna. Yes. Yeah, can I get his contact information?
Existential question. Philosophical.
Well, okay. Maybe not fundamentally think, but at least let's talk about the First Baptist Church.
Sure.
And the archaeology of it is, at least it's forcing us to recognize that this place was here, and the history of it for folks who don't know is that Colonial Williamsburg tore the church down in 1954, 55, and a parking lot went on top of it. The recognition that there's archaeological remains underneath it, that changed the way we're dealing with that site. Parking lot is gone. It'll never be a parking lot again. The excavation is making us to recognize the importance of that space. So it doesn't fundamentally change, I think, our modern thinking, but the archaeology it's making us, in this case, do the right thing.
Well, in the process of discovering it is also building community back again, I'd say.
And those are both wonderful outcomes, the types of things that should happen. Tommy wants to know if a lot of the pottery has maker's marks, and has there been research into who made them or it?
Yeah, the low-fired colonel-ware vessels very rarely have maker's marks on them. Occasionally we will get an X, and this is in Williamsburg. Now, colonel-ware, this type of ceramic is found all up and down the mid-Atlantic. African Americans and Native Americans are making this all up and down the mid-Atlantic, particularly in South Carolina. We see a lot of it, and in those cases we do see a lot of marked examples, but they're very simple marks, and being able to attribute it to an individual, we we can't do. So we've only had a few here, colonel-wise, that have any sort of mark on it that I would say is a maker's mark, and it's just a simple X.
Ethan wants to know if you found anything that helps tell the story of enslaved, and I'll add on free Black children.
I would say yes, actually. In the early 20-teens, I think 2012, 2013, we had the opportunity to excavate in search of the Bray School, which was a school for free Black and enslaved children that operated between 1760 and 1774. And gosh, this may be a changing the narrative thing. One of the things that we wanted to know about that site, we never were able to actually find the school because there is a modern building on top of that structure right now. So one of the things, though, that we wanted to understand is what were children being taught? How was that school operating? And we knew that they were being taught catechism. That was the primary function of that school. And they were also being taught some very basic skills. But we found more than 50 pieces of slate pencil on that site, which suggests that in addition to being taught to read the Bible, which is what we expected, there's a possibility that they were also being taught to write, which is not something that we knew about. And so to look at this small group of children who had the opportunity to study with Ann Wager and to learn some skills that then carried them forward in their lives helped sort of to shape what we knew about education and free Black and enslaved children.
Going back to the First Baptist Church excavation, Carolyn wants to know, does the modern First Baptist Church community have records of who might be buried at the site and how else the remains might be identified?
Yeah, some of that, we're just kind of getting into some of that information now, and some of that information may be in individuals' personal collections. Well, they're in their Bibles, written in their Bibles. The church does have records, and we do have an oral history within the church that in 1953, a member of the congregation identified that her great-grandfather was buried there. So there's one individual that we may be able to connect. Others, though, we've not seen yet in the documentary record evidence of named individuals being buried there, but as part of this project, the community has really embraced this project and is coming forward. The family Bibles are probably opening up now to see what information is in there, and some of that could be in there. I'm excited to learn that.
I am too.
Mm-hmm. Amy wants to know if you were able to differentiate the items that are created by Black artisans versus Native artisans.
That's a hot archaeological topic.
Yeah.
That is you can start a fight with that one.
I think, yes, you're right. You're right.
You can. There are two camps. There are some who believe that it is of native construction, and others who believe that it is made by African Americans. And my guess is that it's a hybrid, that there's some of each. And so this may be one of those places where sourcing of materials and very close attention to details, how it's being produced, may help us to understand. We know in some cases, for example, Lord Botetourt, the governor here in the 1770s, buys earthen pans of the Indians, is what he says in his account book. So he is identifying those as products of a Native American population, but it's entering town through a variety of different sources in the 18th century is our estimation.
Yeah. And here's another instance where we as archaeologists need a large body of data to be able to make really solid interpretations. So yeah, one of the things that we still need are production sites of this material. We've not excavated that I know of in this area a place where we can say people were making it right right here. So we need that data. Now we have it for other areas in the country, but here that's a piece of data we need. So yeah, to be able to draw these conclusions, we have to rely on just every possible source of information we can bring to bear. And you're right, chemical analysis may be one of those pieces of information.
But it just drives home that finding something in the ground is just the first step. That this particular chamber pot that we've been talking about was excavated in 1964, and it's still generating discussion and research now. So lots more still to come.
Now, we've had a lot of rain recently in Williamsburg, and thankfully we have sunshine today. But Jim wants to know if after a heavy rainstorm, or several in our case, do you ever find smaller artifacts like buttons or glass shards that would be washed up or uncovered due to the rain?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. Not so much in town, but it used to be actual archaeological technique for plowed fields to plow them, wait for it to rain, and then walk across and then map where you find everything, because it starts to expose things. That used to be an actual archaeological survey technique. It's not, we don't see it quite as much here because there's a lot of ground cover. But when we excavate, we have to try and keep our units as dry as possible so that sort of stuff doesn't happen, that the water starts to bring those things out of the walls of the units.
Right. Now, we've actually had quite a few viewers ask about what they could take an artifact that they found on their own property to learn about its history. If you have any suggestions for archaeologists in the making.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different places, and it depends on where you are. If you're in Virginia, the Department of Historic Resources is a good place to go to. It's in Richmond. But there's in Virginia, there's the Archaeological Society of Virginia, and they have chapters all over the state, and that's a great place to go connect. If you've got an artifact, you want to learn more about it, and they can also help tell you, okay, well, here's what you need to do now to document that, or perhaps don't dig anymore if you found that they're digging.
And I think this might have to be our last question. Kathy wants to know, how long was the time period between the original occupation of Williamsburg and the restoration? And then I'll add on real quick, what is the biggest thing you've learned from your predecessors in the archaeological field?
Ooh-wee. Okay.
I'm going to grab the first one. So you take the second. So as we know, this land has been occupied and used for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The first European settlement of this town was in the 1630s, when a palisade was put between the James and York rivers, and there was a settlement that grew up around it. And so when you talk about, I'm not great at math on the spot, but 1634 to the restoration started in 1926. So there was, several hundred years there between the two events. And the other question was about, what was it? What was that? What did we learn from our predecessors?
Yes, especially those who've worked here at the site.
Yeah, what's our best takeaway?
Best takeaway. I've been learning a lot recently about our predecessors, in the sense that I've been trying to recognize the names of the people who did the first excavation here. And they were almost entirely black excavators who were identified as laborers at the time. But in going through some oral histories and simply in following the footsteps of their work, we realized that they have been given far less credit for what they understood about what they were seeing than we even knew. And so I've really gained an appreciation for that.
Yeah, I think building on that, going back to the earlier work, we often think, well, they don't do it like we do it today, so they were probably wrong. But then you go and you test that and you realize, oh, wait, no, they were right about a lot of things, but there are other ways that we can do things better now, too. So we kind of, the collection that we have here is unparalleled. And, it's our duty to make sure that we continue to steward it and to continue to study it, and that we continue to ask new questions of it.
That's right.
I think we can't just stop with the questions that were asked in the past, because questions are always changing. And I think we got to continue to ask those questions of this collection and of the sites that we have in Williamsburg.
That is perfectly said, because we've only been able to come this far because of the people that came before us, and that's applicable in every aspect of life. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for our conversation today, but I want to thank Jack and Meredith for hosting us and for all of your expertise. We are also grateful to you all for joining us in this conversation, for sending us so many great questions. And additionally, I'd like to say a special thank you to Ferguson Cares for sponsoring our Black History Month programming. This program and others like it would be impossible without the generous support of our donors. It is only because of you that we can share the complete and engaging story of our nation. We're so glad you took the time to join us here today, and we hope that you'll visit us soon in person at Colonial Williamsburg. Have a great afternoon.